This is Here Before, Here Now, an Arizona's Family Originals podcast.
Hey there, Colton here, launching this podcast. It's called Here Before, Here Now, where we really delve into issues affecting Indian country. Being from the Navajo Nation, I've always wanted to make sure that Native people, Indigenous people had a voice when it came to issues in their community, also across the country. And one of the things that we're talking about is a crisis that's been talked about a lot lately. You may have heard it yourself, the missing and murdered Indigenous women crisis, or the missing and murdered Indigenous peoples crisis. I've got some statistics here, and it's pretty eye-opening how devastating this is to tribal communities. The statistics really are eye-opening. The U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs estimates that over 4,200 missing and murdered cases have gone unsolved, and the murder rates for Native American women and Alaska Native women 10 times the national rates. According to the Urban Indian Health Institute, murder is the third leading cause of death for Native women. So really, to address this crisis, Governor Katie Hobbs had established the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Peoples Task Force back in March of this year. So task force members met for the first time in May. And their goal really is to submit a report about the activities and what they've talked about, possible solutions to address this issue that really outlines potential recommendations for administrative or legislative action. So those reports are due by December 1st every year through 2026. So joining me right now is one of those task force members. It's First Lady of the Navajo Nation, Jasmine Blackwater-Nygren. Mrs. Blackwater-Nygren is a member of the Navajo Nation. She also served as a member of the Arizona House of Representatives. At 25, she was the youngest ever to be sworn in. She's also a graduate of Stanford University and got her law degree from ASU. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Colton, for that introduction. Just to clarify, I'm no longer a member of the House of Representatives.
Right, exactly. Right. You were, yes,
yeah.
You were, definitely. But yeah, oh my gosh, just reading some of your accomplishments online, first off, pretty stellar, the things that you've been able to accomplish. Tell me about yourself.
Sure. So just to start off, in Navajo, because you're Navajo, you know this, when we are asked to introduce ourselves, we always talk about our clans. And so for those who might be listening, who might be Navajo, my first clan is Hushklishni, so I'm born for the Mud People clan. I am Hushklishni, actually, born for Ashihan, the Salt People clan, and then my mom's dad is of the Ute Red Running Into the Water People clan, and then my dad's dad is of the Within His Cover People clan.
Yeah, I know it's a lot. Whenever someone asks me too, I'm like, all that stuff, which is important for us, you know?
It's very important because, especially in Arizona where there's so many different tribes, I feel like there's Navajos everywhere.
Absolutely.
And you have to always be cognizant of that.
Whenever people find out I'm Navajo on the air or whatever, I get messages all the time on my Instagram or my Facebook, like, what's your clan? And it's like, oh, we're related by this degree. Mm-hmm. So keeping those ties is really important and sacred to our people.
It is. And especially, as First Lady of the Navajo Nation, you get to be really careful. When you introduce yourself, you have to always introduce yourself and always be really cognizant of, our traditions and our culture.
When it comes to your role as First Lady, how has that been like? I mean, your husband was elected as the Navajo Nation president, the youngest ever. Mm-hmm. You also, in your credentials, you were also at one point the youngest serving House of Representatives member. Like, that's pretty incredible.
Right. And I think, as young people, as Indigenous people, we're always told to respect our elders. We're always told that, our elders are our leaders. And so as young people, we're kind of coming at this with that mindset, right, that we respect our elders, that we learn from them. But at the same time, understanding that we as young people might have something different to bring and offer to the table. And I definitely saw that in my time as a state rep, for sure.
Mm-hmm. When you're looking back at your life and maybe you can talk to yourself when you were a little girl. Did you imagine all of this would be something that would be in your future?
I did not. I think that when I was younger, when I was little, and when I say little, I'm thinking like 10, 12 years old.
Yeah.
I always wanted to be an attorney, which I am. but I never expected to be at this caliber, at this point in Navajo leadership, where everybody knows who my husband is, where it's not just on Navajo they know who he is, but he gets recognized everywhere he goes almost. Yeah.
And while he does get recognized, you're also making steps in your own regard to, show that you are an advocate for Navajo people, for Indigenous people. And one of those is by sitting on this task force, addressing this crisis. For people who may have heard about MMIW or MMIP, but don't really understand it, explain to our listeners, our viewers, what is it and how severe this issue is? Right.
So I think you kind of touched on it when you provided the statistics that you had. And, it's not a new phenomenon. I feel like it's been in the news more lately. There's a lot more steps that are being done at the state, federal level to kind of address it. But it's not new. This issue has been in our communities for hundreds and hundreds of years. And the issue really is that, and it's not just our women, right? It's our women and our men are going missing, are being murdered at much higher rates than the national average. And as you mentioned, that rate is 10 times more for Indigenous women on some reservations. And so when we think about this issue, it's enough of a pattern that it is alarming. It's an epidemic is what we call it. And it's really difficult to talk about, really,
right.
because it touches I would say that almost every Navajo Indigenous person, whether you're Navajo or you're another tribe, you've been affected by this epidemic in some way, whether, someone in your family's gone missing for a certain amount of time, someone in your family's been murdered, or, there was a homicide in your family. I mean, you are affected by this crisis.
It's devastating. I've been reporting on this crisis for quite some time now, even before coming back home to Arizona during my time in Albuquerque, and just speaking with family members of those who just have no idea where their loved one is or how their loved one was murdered. That's a lot to take in. And as part of this task force, I'm sure you have heard several stories yourself.
For sure. And, it's not just being part of the task force, because I think, as I had mentioned, this has been, something that's been ongoing, and there's been multiple steps to address this at the state level. And the first thing that we saw was back in 2018, there was a legislative study committee that was created. And then in 2020, we had COVID, so that stopped. And then in 2022, we had another committee that was created, and that was under the House of Representatives. So I also served on that committee. And then this most recent iteration of that committee is now under the governor's office. So there's kind of three separate committees, task force, study committees that have been created in recent years. And so I feel like it's a continuation of that, but not really, because now we're seeing this under the governor's office. We're seeing it as something the governor is pushing, which we haven't seen before, really.
Yeah. With this crisis, many states have been impacted heavily, right? New Mexico, for one, Washington, Alaska, and others that have really big Native populations. Is Arizona just barely catching up? Because I remember reporting on stories in New Mexico when these task forces were happening already,
I would say that because of the large amount of tribes that we have in Arizona, right? We have 22 recognized tribes in Arizona. I wouldn't say that we're catching up. I would say that, we're right there. I think we're a lot further along than other states. And I don't want to call those states out, but we're definitely up there when it comes to, how we're addressing this, for sure.
What do you think needs to happen next when it comes to, I know that you guys have met recently.
Right.
So what did you guys talk about? When is this report going to be given out to the governor?
Right. So like I said, it's kind of a continuation of these different things that have been happening over the years. And, last year and even in the 2020 report, we saw a huge amount of legislative recommendations that were included in both of those reports. And we're hoping that this year, we can actually achieve some of those recommendations that were provided. And I think that's what we should see next. I think that's what we want to see next, is that we provided all of these recommendations. And you can look up the many, many reports that have been done here in Arizona. And we're hoping that, we get to tackle some of these recommendations with this task force. And again, like you mentioned, the report is coming out in December, and so we're looking forward to that.
When it comes to the level of recognition that this issue has received, it seems like a lot more people are talking about this now than they were before, even though this has been an ongoing issue. I mean, we've had those TV shows with Hilary Swank, the Daily Alaskan or the Alaska Daily, multiple documentaries out there. Ariana Whitney, who's a reporter here, also just produced a documentary called The Forgotten, really shedding light on these issues. What do you think that's doing to the recognition or the conversation around this?
Right. So I think that, it's good, right? Because we've seen this huge grassroots movement, and that's really what it started as, right? It was a grassroots movement with families who were personally affected by loss. On Navajo, for example, we have the family of Ashlyn Mike, Jamie Yazzie, LMA Begay, and some of these advocates who have been around for a really long time. And so when we see attention finally being drawn to this issue, I think it legitimizes those feelings, those stories, and I feel like we're finally being heard.
When people ask how or why is this happening to this particular group at a higher rate than other, what are some of the answers?
I think that's a really complicated question, and there's a lot of things that we see in Indigenous communities. And I think first and foremost, it relates a lot to, what's happened in our past as a collective people, which is, we were forcibly removed from our reservations. And then some of us, were able to return home, for example, Navajo. But that intergenerational trauma of the, being removed from your homelands. And then we also have the boarding school era. And then we have all of these different things that have happened to our people, the forced sterilization of Native women. And you have, forced relocation through placement programs, and just our people being time and time again faced with all of these outside influences really just coming into our lands. And so when you see that happen to a people, I think there's a lot of trauma that's carried down. And so as a result of that trauma, you see increased violence in families, you see increased rates of poverty. And along with that, you see increased substance abuse, domestic violence. And a lot of those issues are tied to our missing relatives, right? And I'm not saying, every situation is obviously different, but I think that when you really look at the issue, it's directly correlated to intergenerational trauma that we all carry as people.
Right. And it seems like that's a word that is used a lot nowadays. We're bringing awareness to what that means to certain groups of people and how it's affecting them and their daily lives. Do you see, especially when it comes to younger Native leaders, really turning things around? I mean, I would argue that you're a really good example of bringing awareness to these issues and trying to advocate for policies that help, Indigenous tribes and Indian country.
Right. So, sorry, what was
So I guess the question is, yes, we all have heard about this and one way or another have experienced this. But it seems like now there's a push for more younger people to be active and advocate for policies that create better lives.
For sure. No, I've seen that, as my time as a state representative, now my time as a first lady. Definitely the younger generation has a voice. And I think, as I had mentioned earlier, we have something different that we want to bring to the table, that issues that we care about, they're different than we've seen our parents, our grandparents really care about. And when we, the issues are the same. If you look at Indian country, we have the same infrastructure problems that we've always faced. We have poverty rates that are really high. We have health problems. So I think the issues have been the same for a really long time. But when I think about our young people and, my generation, I think we're really interested in solving those problems a little bit differently than our previous leaders have.
Yeah. What do you think is helping with messaging to get out there? I know that right now, gosh, man, social media is a huge platform, right? Is that helping, especially when it comes to these issues?
I think so, for sure. Social media is a big thing. Media in general, I feel like, is being more, they're shedding more light, I feel like, on Indian Native issues, which is helpful. And then you have you have like TikTokers, these famous Indigenous young people who are really using TikTok and other platforms to really shed light on Native issues, which is something we haven't seen before. Usually we have, Indigenous activists who are really well known in the Native community, but now you have, these TikTok influencers who are reaching just huge amounts of people and bringing the issue to the forefront.
What other issues are affecting Indian country that need to be talked about that aren't at this moment?
Right. And so I think when we think about Indian country, again, like we said, or like I've said, I think infrastructure is always a huge, huge issue across Indian country. I mean, we think about Navajo, we have so many miles of roads, and I think 77% of our roads are unpaved. And every year with the monsoon season, we see all of these stories about roads washing out, flooding that happens, people who aren't able to access their homes, aren't able to leave their homes because of the flooding issue. And it happens almost every year. And I think with climate change, we're seeing that at a more intense rate than we have in the past. And so when we talk about Indian country, I think definitely infrastructure is really high up there. Roads, on Navajo, we don't have access to running water. A lot of families don't have electricity. And so even, getting a family a bathroom addition, and I say bathroom addition because I realize that, non-natives don't know what that means.
Right.
Like, what is a bathroom addition? Why is that important? Because a lot of families don't even have bathrooms on Navajo. And so getting a bathroom addition to a Navajo family is actually a big deal because they've never had indoor plumbing. And then they've never even had, an indoor bathroom. They've always had like an outhouse or something like that. And so even something so simple as giving a family a bathroom addition is a big deal. And then, that's directly tied to a lot of the health problems that we see up there, a lot of the increased violence that we're seeing, and just this huge need for public safety. And obviously, I'm Navajo. I was born and raised on the reservation. And so a lot of my views are very Navajo-centric.
Sure.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah, I know, my family, all from the Navajo Nation, on my mom's side, my son, she's no longer with us anymore, but they have a bathroom addition, and I can see like the water line starting to come that way, and I mean, for decades, obviously, it's been the case where that wasn't the case, where outhouses are just a normal part of, life there. And I mean, when I talk about it with other people, they open their eyes like, oh my gosh, really? I'm like, well, yeah, and it's not something that I would say is obviously, it would be nice to have running water and bathroom inside, but like, it just shows the resiliency of, we find ways to keep on living, right?
For sure. And I think that, my time as a state rep, I did a roads tour, right? And this was about 2 years ago. And it was, again, the monsoon season. It was almost exactly 2 years ago. It was monsoon season. Roads were washed out. People were struggling. And like you said, people don't realize what's happening up there. A lot of times you're like, oh, yeah, that's Navajo. They don't have a lot of resources. There's a lot of struggles up there. But I think what really struck me was when I was on that roads tour, we went out into this very rural community of Sweetwater, Arizona. And, they have no roads in that community at all. And we went out and we visited, the most rural citizen of that community. And, we were asking her, and she only speaks Navajo, right? So we were asking her, why is it that you stay here? Why do you stay here where there's no roads? You don't have running water. You don't have electricity. You don't have, you have a dirt floor. And why don't you go out and move to Shiprock or, and she's an elderly woman, and we're asking her all these questions. And she said, well, I'm from here. This is where my family's from. And I don't want to move, and it's that tie to land, tied to place that I think a lot of people don't really understand, that we as Navajo people, we have this unique relationship to the land. And that's something that we don't want to give up in exchange for all these modern day conveniences. That's really at the forefront of, I think, what makes us Navajo is our ties to the land, to our family. to those rich stories, culture, history, prayers, all of that, I think is all tied to land.
Yeah, it reminds me of a story that when I was reporting in Albuquerque, I had done a story about this community on the New Mexico side of the Navajo Nation that has been plagued with health problems, and they claim it was from abandoned uranium mines in the area. And of course, you got to ask the question. So if people are getting sick, if they're getting cancers, if there's birth defects, some people would argue that maybe you should just move from the area. And I mean, their response was, this is sacred land. This is my home. My family lives here. Our umbilical cords are born here or are buried here, So I think when it comes to like the wider scale of people outside of the community, it could be hard for them to comprehend, right? But with this is just kind of sort of something that's innate to the people.
Right. And then when you talk about an issue like missing and murdered Indigenous women or people, those aren't tied to the reservation, it's tied to us as people. And so a lot of times, even though we're tied to a place on Navajo, a lot of these issues will follow our people even off Navajo. So for example, you see huge rates of MMIP cases in Albuquerque and Phoenix, and that's a lot of our urban community who still struggle, with higher rates of violence, higher rates of homicide here, even if you remove them from the reservation. So I think, there's a flaw in that you could just move off and you'll be better off. And we know that's not true.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I know that we had talked a lot about really intense topics. Just for our viewers and listeners to get to know you, what does the First Lady of the Navajo Nation do when she has free time, which I'm sure is few and far between?
Sure. So as First Lady, I think my biggest role is supporting my husband and the administration. And then, as First Lady, I have all these different initiatives that I care about personally, and then that I bring to the office. And so, the first one is MMIP, so what we talked about today, and being at the forefront of that and making sure that, families are heard, that, there's advocacy being done, because I think we've seen a lot of work done. And I always say that I'm really new to this conversation because I started like maybe 2 years ago when I was a state rep. But this is, decades. And like I said, this issue has been affecting our people for centuries. So that's one. And then, education, I think there's a whole, we could talk about issues in education in Indian country as well, but that's a different topic. And then, maternal health. Obviously, I'm expecting my second child. I'm 6 months pregnant.
Yeah.
So I try to tie my initiatives into what I like to do in my free time.
Sure, right? Yeah.
It's like, so I do a lot of walking, hiking, just trying to, be well-rounded in the position and making sure that people see that, that their First Lady isn't just talking about these issues. She's out there, walking and taking care of her health, things like that.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So, my wife is also expecting. By the time this airs, she'll probably have had the baby. But gosh, so 2 kids for me under 3, under 4, because 3 and newborn. Oh man, you're gonna be in that situation too. Are you nervous?
Right.
Excited?
I am excited more than anything else. Our daughter right now, oh my gosh, she's so full of energy. But I know she needs a sibling. She needs a companion. And I think that's the biggest reason we're like, okay, we have to do this, because our little one hangs out by herself. She hangs out with a bunch of adults. It's like, no, she needs a companion. And so that was probably the biggest reason. And we're so excited for her.
Yeah, my son, obviously he's been an only child for the last several years now. And, he's very... he's the most wonderful kid you ever know, right? But he knows what he wants. You know what I mean? Like, he's like a little leader. My mom calls him not Ani, because he can be very like, I want this, I want that. Let's do this. Dad, no. Mom, yes. He's very into his mother right now. He loves his mom. Sometimes I come home, he tells me, "Go back to work, Dad." I'm like, oh my gosh. It breaks my heart a little bit, but I'm hoping that with this new edition, me spending more time with my son will give us more time to hang out and everything while Mama spends time with the baby. So yeah, that's it's fun to bring kids into the mix. It really is.
And that's the whole reason, right, that we do what we do. At least when we talk about my husband and the campaign that we ran, and the theme of our administration is Yidiskondan Sahake, so thinking for the future. And so when we think about all of these issues, right, the ultimate goal is that we're going to leave the Navajo Nation, our Navajo people, better off than it was for us, so that the next generation, whether that's my daughter or the new baby or the people that are her age, that they're just in a better situation in 20 years, 30 years from now. And so we think about that every day when we see her.
Sure,
on
all
the
parents
roads.
do, right?
Mm-hmm,
Yeah,
for sure.
just want the best for their kids.
Exactly.
What are you listening to right now on Spotify? What's on your playlist?
Actually, it's your podcast.
Oh, how funny.
To prepare for this podcast,
Yeah.
I'm gonna listen to his previous podcast. But yeah, that I don't do a whole lot of listening to music and whatnot. Because usually, if we're driving, we're with the little one and she's sleeping or she's preoccupied, so not too much.
Okay, I will say that This Is Halloween from The Nightmare Before Christmas is probably the #1 played song in my house right now. My son loves that. So my Spotify analytics are going to be pretty messed up at the end of the year.
Yeah,
so.
For sure. Other than that, we have a parade playlist that's on my Spotify that's playing sometimes.
Okay.
So on Navajo, it's a lot of parades. It's fair season, as people up there know. We just wrapped up the Gallup ceremonial. We just had the Eastern Navajo Fair. We're coming up on the Chinle Fair here soon, and then Windrock's going to be a little bit after that. So we're trying to nail down our parade playlist that we play as we're walking the parade.
That's awesome. I was the Grand Marshal for that a few years ago.
Right.
And that was a really amazing honor, to see all the Navajo people come out. And it's weird to you know this very well, to be in a position where people who you've never met before know you, and you want to make sure that everyone feels like, you're including them in the conversation, and just wanting to be like really know their story.
For sure. I think they said over 200,000 Navajos come out for the Winter Rock Fair.
Right.
So if you've never been to the Winter Rock Fair, it's a great time to get acclimated to everything Navajo, the food, the culture, everything. But yeah, for sure, people come up to me that I've never met, that I don't know, and I'll be waiting, for my prenatal appointment at the hospital, and I have all these mothers come up to me and share with me their stories, and being receptive to that, I think, is part of the role. And even just going to the store, going to the grocery store, you get stopped. I'm sure you know this as well. But,
Sure.
Does
it ever become too much?
No. But there's some times where it's like, okay, I'm going to send somebody else to the store so that I can stay home.
Sure.
Don't have to take an hour to go check the mail.
Funny. Yeah, that's cool. Well, Jasmine, thank you so much for being on my podcast. It was great talking to you.
Thank you.
This is Here Before, Here Now, an Arizona's Family Originals podcast.